Welcome to Brain Cage, where we discuss BDSM, hypnosis, and the mind for all those exploring their fetishes and interests.
This is Puppet Master, your mentor for the podcast.
And this is Dracoso, your hypnotic guide.
So today we're going to be talking about deprogramming. I have been taught how to deprogram passive programs, but Dracoso spent many years doing this with other things that needed deprogramming, such as self-reinforcing programming and aggressive programming. And they know a lot more about this than I do. So I'll be attempting to ask questions if I can think of them. But Dracoso is going to take the forefront of this podcast. One thing I will add is that this is very much going to be hypnosis based rather than much to do with BDSM, just because of what deprogramming is. But with that, I think I will give you the example that I've been taught for deprogramming triggers. So first I would bring someone under, and then I would get them to imagine a computer screen. I would tell them there is a computer screen in front of them with a lot of files, each containing suggestions and triggers, even things that they may have consciously forgotten, but they'll be there, even if they don't remember them. And they just need to select anything that they don't want to have anymore, drag it into the recycling bin, right click, delete, or empty. Now, one of the advantages of this is you're not going in as a hypnotist, removing things yourself. You're getting the subject to remove what they do not want there anymore, which can be a hell of a lot more effective. There's a lot of vaguity there, in that however they imagine the files are set up, it doesn't matter. They can see what they need to see in their own mind. And I'm using imagery that is something that they can quite easily visualize, because most people have used a computer and deleted files before, which makes it something that is a lot easier for them to process what's happening. But this only really works for passive programming.
Right, and as we talk about deprogramming, one thing to keep in mind especially is that deprogramming looks at the idea that there is already something in place, a programming that the mind or the person has consciously identified as needing to be removed, or in some rare cases that they may not be aware needs to be taken out but may be causing issues. And deprogramming really looks at the idea that you are sitting down with the individual to undo, remove, or alter a current programming that they may be uncomfortable with, they may feel against, they may feel like they didn't want in the first place. And so the three forms that Puppet Master mentioned earlier, passive, self-reinforcing, and aggressive, are terms that I've used in the past to somewhat identify how difficult or how advanced of an interaction it may require. Deprogramming can really look at trying to remove something based upon what is necessary. And so passive programming is programming that's been put in to just act, do what it's meant to do. It's just meant to go off on a natural point where there is someone using a trigger, someone trying to cause a reaction or an effect, and I term it as passive because of the fact that it's programming that in and of itself is just meant to be used. It waits to be used, or it waits to be activated by a person. So it is passively present there. This would be sort of the early stages of deprogramming, if you want to look at it in the sense of difficulty or working with it, as passive programming usually is just set to do an activity and can be removed simply by identifying what originally put it in, why it was put in, how it was put in, and looking at how it works, and just talking with the person as to what they want to have happen, sitting down and creating a concept that they can take control of. And just like with this example of the computer clicking and deleting, it gives control to the individual to shape a format where they can remove or alter it as they see fit. And with deprogramming, a big factor, like Puppet Master said, is about giving them control. You as a deprogrammer, this is, I think, one of the biggest concepts that if I apply or if I try to teach at all with this topic, is to remember that you, in the end, are going to be a guide, and that you are going to be doing the deprogramming as the main person leading the steps, but that the main person or the main being in that interaction that is going to be changing or altering or removing it is the individual that you are working with. Because that person is the one who is experiencing it, they understand how it is affecting them, and in the end, their influence to change it and take control over it is ultimately what is going to remove its influence over them.
It's like how in therapy, it'll be a lot more effective if they want to get better than if they don't care.
And on top of that, it's not only that they don't care, but it's more that they aren't aware that they can change it. That, in one hand, if you're trying to help them overcome it, it's more about having them feel like they have the ability to do it. If we're referring to therapy, and just to make a sort of clarification as well, a very clear idea is, therapy looks at changing and altering large events in a person's life, or very important aspects that may be impacting them that they don't have control over, and allowing them to overcome certain aspects so that they can have a connection to process, to talk, however they may feel they need to go through it. Deprogramming is sitting down and looking specifically at direct ideas or pieces that have been implanted into a person that they are looking to have changed or removed.
It won't fix things that they've done due to the programming that hurts on an emotional level. Like, that's very much the therapy and or recovery side of things.
Right, and so when we talk about deprogramming, getting a bit deeper on the discussion, passive programming is a base point to work from, and self-reinforcing program is still another one that is good to work with, that if you want to learn how to overcome it, as long as it is, and even can be passively self-reinforcing. When you get towards aggressive programming, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, that is where you need to have a good bit of experience and a good bit of knowledge as to what you are trying to address, because self-reinforcing programming is something that will trigger itself repeatedly to stay strong, to work with. It's kind of like a habit that you do during the day, but the programming itself becomes active and works with it. But if it's a passive self-reinforcing program, it's something as simple as when you get up and see the computer, you will feel the need to repeat something 10 times. And this can reinforce itself every day. That becomes a self-set point.
It becomes self-conditioning.
Right. And so a self-reinforcing or self-conditioning program has different methods to address it or deal with it. But again, it also means that the only thing you're trying to overcome is the programming's natural passive point of this happens over and over again, and people can still interact with it. Aggressive programming is programming that has been put in either with some form of self-survival tactic, where it will try to ignore, resist, or act against what people are trying to do to alter or change it or even remove it. And in some cases, even to the point it will be aggressive enough to fight back and even try to reject an individual. As I've seen everything from a passive programming where someone simply wanted a trigger that was connected to a past playmate that they no longer felt comfortable with, to someone who, the moment you talked about hypnosis, they would immediately shut down and talk to you in a monotone state and pretty much outline that they needed pretty much directions from a quote-unquote operator who was in charge of them. So deprogramming can be on a wide spectrum, but you're far more likely, if you have to explore deprogramming, you're far more likely to see passive programming and self-reinforcing than aggressive, mainly because passive programming is simply when a person wants to have something removed, and it's just based upon personal reasons and interests. It's usually programming that they either no longer use, no longer care for, or just want to have removed for one reason or another. Self-reinforcing programming is a little bit more complex. It really depends on how long it's been reinforcing for, what the triggers are, and what the person wants to do with it. So if we were to go off on a simple point of when a person wakes up, one that I remember a while back was someone would wake up, they'd walk over to their computer, they would turn on the computer, and their background was the trigger. They had a picture that would show a spiral, which had a somewhat modified image of themselves kneeling with spiral eyes. And this was just a self-reinforcing trigger that whenever they would see this, they would go into a light trance, and then they would spend several hours in this trance, depending upon the day and the activities.
That's dangerous because it's self-reinforcing, but the idea of someone kneeling down, hypnotized, and all of that is very appealing to the hypno-kinkster. So the point I'd like to make is that it's easy to want to do things which are harder to get rid of because they're hot. And it's good to be aware of what is more dangerous and harder to get rid of, and to try to do things in a safer way. One thing I want to say before you continue is that this is a much more heavy subject than some of the things you've talked about in the past. And while it's going to be great for any level of person to listen to, I hope, it is something that experience will greatly help with being able to do well by a person. So, unless you're particularly experienced yourself, I recommend seeking out someone that is for this stuff. That doesn't mean you wouldn't be able to do it, and trying to fix it, if a person isn't that distressed and you've thought about it a lot and you think you know how to do it and you've listened to this podcast, it can be okay. But if there is some distress within a person about what's happening, or it is dangerous to them, then you really want someone that knows what they're doing to be doing this. To the extent that, in some cases, a hypnotherapist is probably the way to go. Particularly if what's happening to a person is particularly traumatic.
Right. Sort of as I mentioned earlier, it's good to know that passive program and self-reinforcing programming, as long as it's also passive, those are good if you want to try deprogramming and working with someone, because they are far less likely to have a negative outcome due to the fact that they were simply put in there for their purpose, and once the person says they're no longer needed, no longer desired, removing them means that the person connected to it has control enough so that you can work with them to remove it. When you get into aggressive programming, that is where I would say very heavily to really consider how much experience do you have with hypnosis, because a very big part of aggressive programming, which I'll get into in a little bit, a very big aspect to it is understanding that people have certain thought patterns on how they program people and how they put in their own fail-safes to protect their own programming and how they do things. And so taking time to understand different aspects, different perspectives, different outcomes, and having ways to respond if a situation goes bad, or having ways to respond if a situation is going well, but there's no real progress being made, such as it's not opening, but it's neutral. Understanding what is possible, what can happen, how to respond to it is extremely important. The big thing I go off of deprogramming is it makes me think of, I actually have an understanding of morality that I've worked with and even talked with other hypnotists and found a good outline for, is the idea of autonomy, the ability to make choice, have choices, and be able to act as you see fit. And then pretty much well-being as a secondary point, and finally is social contract. The reason I look at this as morality is the primary form of morality is allowing or finding a way to provide choice and free will to others, and to have that ability yourself. To take that away is immoral unless it's going against a higher sense of loss of morality. For example, if you have a friend who says, I'm going to go out and end someone's life, and they're super angry, and you tie them up, that's within morality because you're stopping a greater loss. But the reason I bring this up is to understand with deprogramming, the secondary step, which is well-being, is the ability to take care of others and know that you have some capability to support them and keep them safe through these experiences. So with deprogramming, when it comes to aggressive programming, it's far more vague what may happen. It requires more preparation. And so just sort of to outline and to eventually move into that topic, is that's probably going to be a good majority of it, as the first two are far simpler to address. Passive programming, you want to give the person a system to a similar or even simpler complexity to what was programmed in, because this allows them to take control over it and remove it, especially because if they are asking for help with it, that some experienced hypnotees and subjects will simply be able to sit down and say that it doesn't affect them anymore. Whenever someone says it, they will train in their own responses. If they're coming to ask for help, it means that they're looking for an alternative solution, possibly something that connects with them that they can use that they may not have thought of yet. This comes back to the training and the teaching that we discussed in the last podcast. For self-reinforcing programming, the way that you would usually work with it or alter it or prevent it is to alter the trigger, or to give them something else to focus towards, or simply to disconnect the pattern. For example, with the picture of the spiral and the own person kneeling and having spirals in their eyes, removing that image or having them change it was one method. Having them put up a different image that's similar, such as one suggestion I gave them, which I think they used later on when they were having a lot of stress, was to put up a picture of a spiral and themselves in a powerful pose, such as standing with their hands on their hips turned to one side. And it reshapes the trigger for whatever they're doing. If it's an auditory trigger, such as they hear their alarm go off, change their alarm. It's a straightforward point, or make it so when that alarm goes off, have it so that they do a different habit. Change. If it's been reinforced for a long time, it may go off automatically. In that case, you may need to more so change the trigger so it goes off or sounds different, and the brain, the connection it makes, begins to change or reshape. There is an idea of extinction with triggers where they will over time disappear, but that also means that they can be reinforced. For example, a lot of people know about the idea of Pavlov and training the dog. And one thing that came up after the study, which a lot of people always talk about, yes, you can train a dog to salivate. The idea was they would put meat out, so the dog would smell the food, it would salivate, they'd ring the bell. They'd repeat that about a dozen, maybe up to 20 or 30 times, and then they would remove the meat, and they'd ring the bell, and the dog would salivate. This is a form of programming. An interesting idea with extinction is a lot of people may not know that after a while, they kept ringing the bell and doing this, and they found that the response got weaker over time because it was not being reinforced by the original conditioning. And so it shows that over time there is something of an extinction effect where it will become weaker, but for many cases, it may be a self-reinforcing trigger where it is trying to continuously exist by using that trigger and causing the reaction. Somewhat training or classically training the person or conditioning them.
I think a mantra is a good example of that.
Right, having a mantra that is important to them, that they feel personally connected to, and it makes sense. Having a mantra that is just said, you will say A, B, and C, is not very strong, unless it's already known as a personal point to them. If the words in it are personally important, if you describe to them, when you say this line, it means this. When you say this line, it creates a much more in-depth understanding. And for deprogramming, you have to look at what are the pieces that connect with a self-reinforcing programming. If the programming is woven into a personal experience of theirs, defining the difference between what that personal experience of theirs was and what the trigger does is one way you can begin to distance them, so to speak. Thinking of it as, I knew one person who loved to feel very adrenaline based, and it would help them to go blank and clear their thoughts. And whenever they would wake up, a lot of the time some of these triggers which are self-reinforcing are usually in the morning or sometime during a specific activity they do during the day. This person would get up in the morning, walk downstairs, and look out the window. And when they'd look out the window, they would always see a red mailbox they had over by the road. And when they were much younger, they had gone out to the Grand Canyon, if I remember right, and they had seen a bird. It was brown, but when the sun hit it at the right angle, it turned red, and the person was imagining what it would be like to fly over this giant canyon, and they had this big rush of adrenaline, and all they could think about and focus on was that red bird. And so when they would walk downstairs and they'd look out the window and they'd see that red mailbox, they'd get a rush of adrenaline and just go blank. They would just feel extremely excited, and it would connect back to this old past experience. Now, the way that we broke it, because they realized after a while that they were very tired throughout the day because of the fact that this would work them up and it would wear them out, we sat down and we talked about the idea of the fact that it wasn't just the color. And it wasn't just the idea that having this red color outside of where they are, which was some of the program they did where they would say that by it being outside and at a distance they couldn't reach, it would be beyond their scope, and so it would seem more exhilarating, that it would be something they could go for. And by showing just how different that past memory was, that flying bird, the fact that it was over and at a specific location, that it helped them to reduce the reinforcement till eventually when they went out and they looked, it was like a normal day. They would just see the mailbox and they would feel normal. So it really comes down to understanding how the trigger works and how it's been programmed to connect. And remembering that these are both passive forms of triggers, these are both passive forms of programming, so that as we move into the aggressive forms of programming, which I'll be talking at much more length, because passive and self-reinforcing programming are much more common. People work with them and they try to understand them. They try to work alongside them and remove them. Aggressive programming is where you get resistance and where you are now working not just with the individual, but you are also working against the ideas and the constructs of other people that have been put in there that are meant to refuse or resist the idea of what the person wants. And it becomes something of a push and pull situation where you have the programming now trying to keep itself established and the person trying to remove it. And it really becomes more complex because rather than it being a discussion where you're trying to understand the programming from the person who's put it in, there's now programming in that the person may not have access to or awareness to. It may be put in a way where you are now trying to counteract things that you may not know. And so it's really about being more gentle and cautious above all else when it comes down to aggressive programming. Because, especially with aggressive programming, you do not want to try and confront it. You are pretty much going to be addressing something that if you try to confront it, it may activate and become far worse, because then it will no longer be accessible to the person doing the hypnosis and may become harder for the person who is within it to access it. But before we get into that, are there any other thoughts, any questions so far, Puppet, that we should talk about?
I mean, I really find the real life examples you give to be very interesting, and the variety that you've talked about with me here and outside of the podcast, it really shines a light on how individual each case is going to be, and how much thought and energy it will actually take to help someone out, compared to this is the kind of induction I do. Hopefully it'll work well. We'll see. I'm going to give you these triggers in this way. Lazy hypnosis. We've all got our own go-to pattern when we want to do something quickly. Hopefully everyone can adjust. But when it comes to deprogramming the more difficult things, it's really often such an individual process that they're never going to be the same with each person.
True.
The easier ones, when it's passive, you can just use the example that I've given and it'll tend to work fine. But the aggressive programming in particular, that's something else.
Yeah, and with aggressive programming, there are even levels of difficulty within that. So I'll try to give as much knowledge. And I think just starting off here and saying that this is based upon several years of exploring. I've worked with a lot of different people who've wanted deprogramming, and I've seen aggressive programming in multiple forms, from very simple ones where you begin working with someone to deprogram it, and as they're going under, they just say no, where they may have a part of themselves feels like they need that to be there. I've had one person who was programmed that whenever they were called a good person, that they would feel very fulfilled, very safe, very wonderful, and a part of them, even though it was months after the two of them had broken up and were no longer together, a part of them was afraid of that by removing this, that it would be the final point where they have to accept being abandoned by this individual, is how they had subconsciously shaped it for themselves, and they weren't aware of that effect. So sometimes aggressive programming can also be relatively straightforward, where it is one specific idea or one specific point is being resistant, and it's for personal reasons, and in these situations it's more based upon the person who is being hypnotized feeling uncomfortable with it being taken out in a subconscious form. That, I will say, is rare, but it is also, I say simple in the sense of compared to more difficult versions of aggressive programming. I'm not saying simple as in their issues and what they talk about are simple, but it is simple in the sense that it is a process where now you are sitting down and talking with the individual, discussing these feelings, figuring out what they want, and really deciding and taking another step of discussion with them to figure out what they want and what they need to do. Aggressive programming, as I said earlier, is programming that will try to resist or defend itself or try to keep itself from being removed or altered. The main thing to understand, especially with aggressive programming, other than being gentle and cautious, is to understand that you want to connect with the individual who is experiencing this as much as possible, and you want to try and understand them as much as possible. The individual that is within it needs to understand that the programming can be controlled. Now, in the most extreme forms of aggressive programming, discussing controllability can trigger it and make it defensive. So understanding that when I'm going forward discussing aggressive programming, I'm going to be giving you a very general point that the further up this aggressive spectrum we go, the more hands-off you need to begin. The more pulled back and cautious you need to be and less direct, because the more aggressive a programming is, the more on guard it's going to be. And so the reason I'm referring to it as being something of a separate being, which I'm going to do, is to understand, especially, to always remember this is, programming in any form of hypnosis and any form of piece that you work with is always a construct that is made in the mind of the person you're working with. Even if someone tries to put in an alter or a personality, many people say that alters do have their own personality, their own thoughts. That can be very true. The biggest thing to always remember, though, especially when an alter is being created, is it is based on the original thoughts and ideas of the person who it was created within, and then it eventually may take on a life of its own. I'm only bringing this up to understand that a programmed-in construct that is defending itself, even if it is an alter, even if it is just simply programming that's set up like a computer system where each piece connects to another piece, and it doesn't have a self-driven understanding that grows on its own. The further up this spectrum we go, the more careful, the more consideration, and in many cases the more experience is necessary to be able to react, respond, and understand to create this actual successful deprogramming. And that ultimately you are trying to guide the person who is within to have more control so that you can work with them. In a sense, like I said earlier, you are the foundation. I believe I said this in the past podcast, is you are your base. What you experience, what you go through, what you've been through for years is who and what you are. And even if it is more or less than another person, you understand who you are more than anyone else because you're the one who's experienced it. So when you are doing deprogramming, as the hypnotist, your role is to try and help the person who is being deprogrammed to understand how much control they can have and give them the steps that help them to look past the programming and begin to undo it in many ways, and giving them guidance so that you are the one taking it apart with them so that they are showing the loose edges, the loose points to take it out. For the person who's being hypnotized, the main thing to understand during a deprogramming is that the person who is working with you may or may not, especially if it's a very aggressive programming, there may be aspects that the person hypnotizing you or that is working with you will have to work very subtly or covertly in order to allow you to remove that programming. Because as you get further and you get more hands-off, you may need to work more covertly on creating a structure of your own that the person is going to depend on to remove their internal construct of programming that is acting aggressive. So, starting on the spectrum towards the lower end of it, it is programming that is simply a one-point protection of itself in some ways. It would be if you go in and try to tell someone that you're taking out a programming and they simply say, only this person is allowed to change it or remove it. This is it is not as aggressive because, one, it means you can interact with it and it is informing you of how it works, which means you can then sit there and you can try to talk about the logic of it, saying, is this person still around? No. Okay. Is this still being used? No. Okay. And then simply trying to find a method to work with. Now, again, this is a straightforward method where it is interacting with you. If you move a little bit further up the scale and you come in and you say, is this person no longer here? And they give you something along the answers of, that doesn't matter. It means that now it's a 2-point, where 1, it is not letting you change things, but 2, it is also not listening to logic. So this is sort of how it builds up over time, is it will create step-by-steps trying to feel out what's there. So how to address and how to deprogram along each of these levels. At first, if it is responsive, but it is not denying. In other words, if it is saying that a certain action cannot be taken or something is out of the control of the person that's there, discussing whether or not this trigger is necessary, discussing certain aspects of logic which loosen it. It has to be there, but it's not being used. That means that over time it may lose strength. Sitting down and talking with the person about why this trigger needs to be there and making this programming itself in some cases address whether or not it's still necessary, or whether or not the purpose of that trigger was to be used. If that's the case, saying if that trigger is meant to be used, but there's no one using it, then that means it's failing its purpose. With deprogramming, interacting with the person who is there, who is communicating with you, is how you're going to get this trigger to change. So sitting there and discussing with them, why was this trigger originally put in place? Well, it was so that we could use it so I could enjoy pleasure. Well, if it's not being used anymore, why did the person who put it in there, why did they want to use it? If the person says, I don't know, that's another point to work off of, because then if they don't know why it was put in there, the programming won't know why it was put in there either. If the programming has a reason that the person who's awake doesn't know, that creates another step. And it creates a discussion where now you're making the person aware of what the programming is. And as they understand more about it, what it does and how it works, you're putting more control into the hands of the person who the trigger is within. So you are actually now outlining for the person this trigger that's saying that other people can't touch it and work with it. Well, there's actual reasoning behind it. And if not, if even the trigger doesn't know why the trigger is there, you can simply work away at the pieces and say, if you don't know why you're there, then do you know when it might be triggered elsewhere? It's like, only by the master. It's like, yes, but even the master didn't know why. They didn't even know what would cause it. And it creates this it creates a loose point where you begin to poke at the holes that are in this programming. And even if it goes into full denial, you can still sit there and create constructs around it. You can create ideas of, okay, I'm going to create an identical trigger then for myself. That's not stoppable. And then just use that trigger. And it will immediately make the programming now pretty much confused. It can create alternative outcomes to a more positive running. If it's confused, it's good then to treat it as a discussionary point with either the programming or with the person, depending on the situation. As you work up the line towards more aggressive programming, you find that it's more about building this understanding. Especially, I may have already said this, but it's about building the understanding so the person who's being hypnotized is creating their own structure to understand the pieces. It's kind of like, imagine a building that's been crafted in a location, and in most cases, you could just go in and demolish it if you wanted to get rid of it. The issue is that inside of the mind, it's been crafted in a way where the person may not fully be aware of how it is built. So destroying it, because usually buildings that are destroyed through different means, it's because of how the building was created and how they have to destroy it. Certain materials, certain things make it so you have to destroy it. A wrecking ball is used for more buildings that are not as reinforced. And you'd usually go off of explosives if the building is more reinforced, but there is a clear area nearby. So not knowing what the building is made out of makes it much harder to know what steps you need to take to get rid of it. For just a real life example. For a simple example of a low, I guess I could say level 1. It's not really levels, but for a very low point aggressive programming would be
a Dracoso level 1 aggressive program. The Dracoso scale.
I'm trying to keep it vague because of the fact that if I start doing levels, if it's a relatively straightforward, there's only one point at which it's defending. It is a straightforward communication where you just need to build up the idea with the person that this trigger is no longer really necessary. The idea that you can't access it isn't really one that they need to accept. That if this trigger was put in there, it's a trigger that that person controls, they own in some ways, and it's a part of their mind and their reasoning. Helping them to realize that, come to that understanding, and begin to flex it and build it out. If the person is not as open or understanding, saying, I don't know how to do that, usually with a passive programming, you would put in something like a computer or some type of programming that they can connect with, that they can build or they can remove things easily. With an aggressive programming, the idea is to identify, and for my example, I had a girl who had a very similar situation with this, where they were told that every time a trigger which was used, I won't use the exact trigger, but I'll use an off one, which was, I'll just use Featherfall, is whenever they would say that trigger, only that one person could say it, and only they could use it, and only they could remove it. That was the program. The programming would reject it whenever someone else would try to use it or change it. And so sitting down and looking at where the outline is, I told them I could create a trigger that is just feather paw, feather stall, feather tall, all these different things that are just one step away. And it shows, well, okay, I have control over all of these things. Why wouldn't I have control over these? Well, because the programming says so. Okay. Well, let me ask you this. Who put in the programming? This person. Are they around anymore? No. Okay. If they're not around, no one's using it, which means it's going to grow old. It's not going to work. It's not going to be there. And just talking with the person so they understand that there are concepts and aspects that make it controllable. Talking about the fact that they put it in. Did they tell you why? Did they reinforce it very much? Did they do this? Did they put this in with it? Talking with them and having them outline and understand what it does creates a much more understandable point where they can say, oh yeah, okay, it's just this. In a lot of our lives, and this is going to come into play very much across the spectrum, in a lot of our lives, we take a lot of things for granted because we don't have the time to analyze all of the systems that we deal with. When we interact with other people, we don't sit down and ask ourselves why this person is a friend, why this person is a best friend, other than remembering all the good times we've had with them, all the personal experiences, and the reasons they might have done things that made us feel closer to them. On a deeper level, there are a lot of psychological factors that play in that make us feel comfortable, make us feel driven, make us feel a commonality with individuals, even if they're completely different from us. And even nowadays, a great example is we used to have best friends with people that were face-to-face all the time. Nowadays, we can have best friends that are online, who we might have only seen pictures of, or even just seen on video. We've never been face-to-face with. We've never actually, patted each other on the back or spent time together in real life, and that's not a necessity. But it's a point that our minds can adjust and take things in stride where it will, I can't say tune out, but it will almost accept automatically certain aspects in order for the logic and reasoning to continue. So that it makes sense as we push forward and we make decisions consciously and subconsciously on how things work so that we can respond to them more quickly and deal with situations more fully. There's less processing. The reason I go over this is because with aggressive programming, a lot of the time when something is programmed into you, the person that has the programming in them has not stopped long enough to question the different pieces of it, to process why each of them works or how they connect or how they go through. And so sitting down and seeing what that person is aware of is the first place to start. So as we get towards the more difficult points, so I'd say the next step up would be when not only there is a programming that is refusing, but it's also protecting itself to some degree.
Was this Dracoso scale 2 or 3?
Oh, stop. There is no specific level.
Actually, it needs to be a Dracoso scale.
I know you're gonna type up a scale, and you're gonna put up the sexy deprogramming scale,
when
and
I'm editing this, I'll be going through and I'll be working out a scale. Yeah, the Dracoso scale.
Oh my gosh.
Of programming.
Okay. Of deprogramming.
Well, of aggressive programming. The Dracoso scale of aggressive programming. Yes.
Sure. So we'll just say the next step up. An example I had was there was a very nice girl that I knew. She had a programming that made her, I guess this is just so you understand a bit of the complexity of what this was. She had a program in her that did something. That's how she described it to me. Did something, she just knew she was uncomfortable, she just didn't know what it was. And we did a session, I sat down, and I found out that it was a programming that over the day, when she would think about hypnosis, anything NSFW, she would begin to feel more aroused towards a past hypnotist she had. He had put this in as an ongoing control in the hopes to make it so that she would never, be interested in leaving him as some sort of an arousal control. And he was the one who ended up breaking off the connection, but apparently not undoing this.
I want to add here that I've learned that it can be important to set up for someone else to help undo things after a relationship if this is something that risk away you've agreed to get into. Because having someone else help you takes the control away from the person that put it in the first place. So it can actually be a positive thing to set up for someone else to come in and help with it in case the relationship fails. Would have been a better way for this to have gone. But instead they ended up having to find you.
Right, and I think a big aspect to consider as well is aggressive programming can also be consensual and it can be malicious. So what I'm mainly been talking about is more of the malicious side where it is put in, or I guess you could say consensual or non-consensual.
It can be both. It can be consensual and malicious.
When I say malicious, I mean it was put in without the consideration of the person who it's being put into.
Gotcha.
In a sense, malicious being that you are acting, and I may be misusing the word, but the way I imagine it is it's being used in a way that would be directly against the idea of what the person wants or is looking for.
Yeah, that's consensual versus non-consensual.
Right. So to be more specific, there's consensual where you've agreed to put some type of programming in, and the programming itself was agreed that it would be self-reinforcing, it would be aggressive, where it would make it so other people couldn't undo it as a protective form. And then there is non-consensual, where it was put in to protect itself, to sustain itself. So this form of the girl not being aware of it, this was actually a non-consensual programming. I can tell you a consensual program after that very quickly, but the non-consensual form with this one was the programming was set in where it would continuously activate itself and was not allowed to disable or turn off, and it was not allowed to let her or other people know it was there. So the first question that might come to mind is, how do you address that? Because if that's the case, it's not going to let you be aware of it. Well, the thing is, you sit down, and before the session, I talked with her and asked her about what she was noticing happening. She was able to identify that it felt like she was getting really worked up, and she felt like she felt a pull. She doesn't know what it was or why it was. And when I talked with her a bit more, I'd ask her about when it was, and at first she didn't know, so I told her to go pay attention and try and spend some time seeing when it happened, what was going on. We identified that it was because there was hypnosis, or there was a couple of her kinks that she had outside of hypnosis that would trigger this. And when I asked what she felt she was drawn to, she felt like she was drawn to a person, but she didn't know who. She worked with a few hypnotists since that last person, or since the person who put this in. And so when I finally put her under, I simply put in a programming, because the thing is, even with that two-step where people aren't allowed to be aware of it and it's put in, I simply had to put in a programming that I reinforced that would give her control over her arousal, and that would give it so that she wouldn't feel arousal to hypnosis or kinks unless she chose to, and that if it was at a normal point where she was just walking around thinking about it, it wouldn't turn her on involuntarily.
And I'm guessing that because the intention behind the original suggestion wasn't being enforceable anymore, that it could naturally become extinct.
It was becoming extinct because of multiple reasons and a few other steps we had.
Okay.
For one thing, the goal of it ultimately was so that she would go to this person and that he was the one that would get her off. The only thing is that because, and I believe he actually programmed in that she would have to go to him, eventually she was reaching points at certain times where she would need to get off and couldn't. So her mind was now pretty much creating this necessity to be released, which pretty much broke the cycle, because if it couldn't complete its full run of get aroused, go to this person, they finish it, the mind begins to question the necessity, and it begins to see the holes in it itself. And even if it's reinforced and programmed very, very deeply, all you need to do is to convince the awake individual, because they're already wanting this to be changed. It's to show them that this end point, at any point in that cycle, if it can be interrupted, altered, or changed, putting in a programming that does not directly defy the original programming, such as you have full control over your own arousal, the original programming would have a resistance saying, well, whenever you see this, you have to do this. And then you have to go to him. Well, if you program in that now this person who can't get the end goal of releasing that pleasure, that arousal, creating something where they are now controlling. I think the specific first step we did was making it so that she was in control of the idea that she could pretty much say that he had given her permission. And then from there, taking the step where she's now the one who's in control of saying that she has permission because she's creating the trigger. Which then means that you take a step back and say that she's controlling the pleasure. If she's controlling the pleasure, that means that she can take a step back and say she's controlling the arousal, and building it out to understand where the control can start and build out from there. As you get further up this scale, so I'll go up another point. Yeah, I know, I'm building the scale like you're saying now.
Dracoso scale, this is level 4 on the Dracoso scale?
It's level 9.5 3/4 all at the same time.
Okay, I'll work that out. Okay. I'll take
Anyways, do a math equation and put that as the next step.
Is the scale logarithmic? Or
it's a formula. You're on scale A plus B equals W. Anyways, the level for this point is you have a programming that's been put in. Again, still going on the non-consensual. Actually, I said I was going to do a consensual. For a consensual that was aggressive, we had someone who wanted to have a programming that, and this was more of a bratty programming, but they wanted to be programmed so that whenever someone would tell them that they were very good, they would automatically say, no, they're a word that rhymes with itch that starts with a B.
Biznitch.
Yep. And they would do this over and over again and get more aroused. And if someone tried to undo it, that same personality would kick in during trance and make it so it couldn't be undone, which made them feel helpless and turned on, because it means no matter what, this trigger would be able to kick in. Because it was no longer necessary, it had been about 1.5 years or so, and they no longer were with the hypnotist, and it felt more degrading in a negative sense. We sat down and we discussed it, and we realized this trigger wasn't really necessary. They didn't really agree with that. And then pretty much all I really had to do for this, which was very straightforward, was I would activate the trigger. They would say, no, I'm a this. And I would say, are you really? And they'd go with, yeah. And I'm like, really? Because I believe that we've said otherwise. Are you sure? And you show the whole very clearly. And that way the trigger itself becomes null, because it gets contradicted in the very sense of its existence. So in some cases, if it's willing, you now have the person already aware that it needs to be removed, but there's some part of themselves that isn't identifying it, and you just create that hole where they can put in that understanding to get rid of it. For another step up from this point, which that's still as the same one as the last story, the next point up is where it is refusing to be changed or altered. It is refusing the idea that it can be changed or altered, such as holes can be directly shown that it is wrong. And then a step further from that is it begins to activate something else that protects itself. Or it may go by another level of simply going out. Pretty much, at this point, it's now activating something. So if you try to change something, and this activation can be sooner, it can be if it's denying you changing something and you try to, it then may activate something. But the next step up is when it begins creating or doing responses to protect itself, to actually act against you. So a very simple form of this was I had another person that I worked with that when they were put under, they would have a programming where whenever they'd be laying in bed and they weren't going to sleep, they were just laying in bed to relax, they would start feeling sensations across their body, where they would be experiencing touches, very intimate strokes, things that would make them feel very turned on and very owned, because they enjoy the idea of being a puppet. You might be familiar with that, Puppet Master.
I don't do a lot with that. Only once has it really been requested, so that may surprise you.
Okay. That's good to know.
I tend to go very much with whatever the subject's into, and then working with that to push their buttons. But that's besides the point. Deprogramming.
Yes. So, with this person specifically, they would feel these sensations, and when I would try and sit down and address it, and I would say, I think the first time we tried to go into it, I'd ask them, when they were awake, they no longer wanted to feel this. They no longer wanted that to be there. When I put them into a session and tried to talk with them during it, because we realized there was something that they felt they couldn't overcome outside of trance. And that's a good thing to figure out, is sitting down and figuring out before you do a session, how much can you accomplish by just talking with them and discussing and figuring out how much they believe it still applies to them and how much they understand it, versus going into the actual trance and beginning to work with what is there and seeing where the limits of what they can do and what the limits are with what they can do while in trance. So when they're in a trance state and I was working with them, I would go in and I'd start very straightforward, and I would just say, I'd talk with them about the trigger that they had, where it would go off whenever they lay in bed. And then I would ask, would you like this to be removed? And they would, of course, say no. But then the next response they would have is, I don't feel comfortable. And then they would immediately wake up. So a protection that was put in that would make it so that, one, it pretty much wouldn't negate our discussion from earlier, but it would make it so that I could not directly address it. So what I did was I spent some time talking with them about the touches, because they were comfortable with that, and discussing what it meant to them, why it was important, how it worked. From there, we talked a little bit about why it felt so important that this other person was there and why they were working with them, and built out their awake mind to understand why that trigger worked in such depth or at such length. From there, we went back into a session, and all I did was I sat there and I just described doing those touches in a similar format, as if it was from someone they felt more comfortable with or more outlined, and just asking if they still feel comfortable with this. They said yes, and it showed the difference between their mentality of, this experience can be felt outside of the trigger. The trigger does not allow anyone to work with it directly, which means all I need to do is take pieces of that trigger and have them experience it or have them identify it in a different format and ask if it still applies the same way. By doing this, it lets their mind create more of an understanding of where the limits are for that trigger without directly working with it, without having to interact with it. That's where it's a non-responsive trigger, and the main thing you want to do is to create a similar understanding of all the pieces of that trigger so that that person has more control over the pieces of it. Once you've created almost an identical trigger to it, where it could be doing a similar thing, where you could say, okay, well, I've done this. Now, I just remove it. In fact, I could even say, I create it again, and now I have you remove it. You can just take the pieces apart. Like a little box screwed together, you just take all the screws off of it and you take it apart. You have all the pieces now.
My box.
Yep. And so this gave them the ability to see, okay, I have control over this, and then I wouldn't look at them, I would just say to them, the other person that put this in, while they're awake, of course, since it's non-responsive during it, I'd just say, the other person that put this in place, they built the same thing, only they're not around anymore, which means that that box is no longer, quote-unquote, protected. It's no longer being watched. And so I just let them go over and undo it, and it fell apart. Literally, there was no reason why they couldn't talk about it. We just talked about it. There was no reason that it had to still be there, because the person that it was connected to was no longer going to be in their lives, so those sensations were only uncomfortable because of that person, not because the trigger could do that to her. And by giving them more depth, more understanding, they now had control over it. And so this leads up to some of the higher levels, which begin to cross over on certain aspects. I'll just say, and I'll try to keep it as simple as possible because there is a wide variety of how things can get as they get more complex. But I'll say there are ones that you can have pretty much the most extreme. I'll say the very, very top of it is one that is completely unresponsive. I've had one example of this, and the only reason it's at the very top is because not only is it one that was non-responsive inside and outside of trans, it had that much control, but it was also that the person themselves had been programmed to not feel like it was a bad thing, to believe it's what they needed, and it was beginning to impact their lives, their job, and their ability to survive.
This is the one that you told me took you sitting down with them 6 hours straight.
Roughly 6 hours. And so it'll be a little bit more detail for this one because this is a very specific situation and it had a lot of programming. The two earlier levels that I would say, try and keep this to a limited. I know, I've made a scale. Stop it. Anyways, think of it as at the top of the scale if you want to do 4, 5, 6 at this point. A 4 would be not only is it non-responsive and deactivating itself, but it begins to cause a negative response from the person. So in other words, they begin to feel uncomfortable. They begin to feel like the hypnosis is discomforting to them, and they feel like they can't continue to some degree. So sometimes people will program it and make it so that you don't feel comfortable working with others. Another step is for people, not only does it make them feel uncomfortable, but it also makes it so that hypnotizing them is more difficult. So even if they become comfortable again, it may make the original method you used to hypnotize them even less effective, where they may not respond to it at all. And then the final step, which is the one we were just talking about, and it ranges based upon how open or how much the person themselves has been influenced. It is when the programming is able to control their awake self in some direct sense to trigger them. It doesn't require to be going into trance. And it begins to control how they reflect, what they can say, what they can't do, and how it works overall. And can even activate itself while talking while awake from anything that relates back in a vague sense to what might begin the path towards them being deprogrammed. For the ones that when they wake up and they become uncomfortable, the main way that you would want to help to avoid this, and it's probably the simplest of these three, is having that full discussion ahead of time, understanding why they do hypnosis, why they would want this undone, and having a deeper understanding and connecting and having them understand that you're here to help, you're someone that they can talk with, you're someone that they can trust. So even if they are having a discomforting or uncomfortable feeling where they can't do hypnosis, having other topics and showing them that there are more things that you can do rather than that aggressive point. Because just as you say, there's what's known as positive reinforcement, which is you did a good job, here's a reward. Negative reinforcement is not punishment. So to clarify that, punishment is when you say you did something wrong, this is the consequence. Negative reinforcement is using something that makes you feel less likely to engage in it. So in other words, let's say if you have ice cream in the fridge, lots of people love ice cream. Imagine if someone put, say, a badger that sat near it. Very angry badger. Well, it's in the freezer. Let's not freeze the badger. Let's say someone put a big old tub of, for people who love this flavor, I hold nothing against you. I use this as an example because it's more likely than not people will not like it, but if you want, just alter this into something you really don't like. Imagine if there's a big old stick of black licorice that by touching the ice cream, it will get it all over your hand, and the only way to get it off is eating it. For most of you who are now sitting there going, ugh, I apologize. For the point that I'm making...
Pineapple pizza. Sorry.
Bad.
I like it.
I like pineapple pizza. Why? Anyways, the main thing that I would say here is negative reinforcement is when you try to create something by engaging in an activity, you are going to become less comfortable or you are less likely to want to do that activity. An example they used to do, or they did in psychology, was they took a child and they'd put a bunny out for the child to go over and say hello to. But whenever they would get close, a loud noise would go off, which would scare the child. And eventually, this was decades ago, so just so you know, this isn't like a nowadays practice. This is just a very strong example. the child eventually was negatively reinforced to no longer want to go near that bunny because it thought a loud noise would go off. But again, this is different from punishment, which is you did the activity and it was wrong, and now you get punished. Negative reinforcement is to try and discourage the activity by creating a negative connection to it as it's happening. So this is a form of negative reinforcement where someone is being pretty much has been programmed that if they try to undo this programming, it creates an uncomfortable feeling for them that directly connects to the activity, and therefore they feel less likely to work with it. The thing is that you want to have a very clear point in their mind where instead of them connecting the uncomfortable feeling with you, you want that uncomfortable feeling to be directed towards the programming. So by having a rapport with the person, by having rapport, not a rapport, but having rapport with a person, you can give them this strong sense that you are the interaction that they are feeling is positive, while the programming itself is what's creating this uncomfortable feeling. So creating a strong base rapport with them is how you can overcome that, and following the similar steps to before, taking it apart both outside and inside of trans. It's the main point. The next step up, which is where, if I remember right, is when they are brought out and they are not only uncomfortable, but they're making it so it's more difficult to do hypnosis, which means that your induction or the method you used is now being guarded against. So
13 on the Dracoso scale.
Oh, gosh. I guess we skipped a couple numbers. I thought we were using a formula. We were no longer using just numbers or letters. But anyways, the next level with this is
14.
Stop it. It's the same. Sorry, it's the same level.
13. With
this type of programming, one, being flexible in your forms of induction is a base to understand. That's a very straightforward point to understand with it. For another thing is you can actually use that as an entry point. The fact that they found that rejection of that new induction, even though it worked, they're now rejecting it, makes them aware of the fact that there are things their mind can do that the programming does not account for. Which means that now you can point that out and use that as a point to actually work in and to clear and open more space for them to be aware that, okay, well, if I'm able to do this and the program doesn't account for it, then the next one won't be accounted for either. And you can create these points, and it's more about doing it. And I guess as we get to these higher points,
14.
It's about understanding that you're... I didn't say we're going to another level. I just said as we get to the higher points, like the 4...
I'm just saying that would be next.
As we're in levels 4, 5, and 6, because I want to keep consistency.
So keep going.
It's also good to... It's good to remember that we need to work in a more subtle sense. When I say subtle, I mean sitting down and saying, straightforward, the programming is not accounting for this. If it's set in the correct way at times, or if it's set in not the correct way, if it's set in a certain way, the programming can try to learn and adapt and say, oh, then I should account more often. What you want to outline is a more subtle way of saying, well, it's a good thing the first time worked. After all, it means that, like we said, we're trying to get somewhere. And it means that there are inductions that work. And they'll say, yeah. And it keeps it more general. It keeps it a truth, and it lets them realize there are things that are working, which gives them more of a sense of control and empowerment. And so as you begin to work in, finding something else that works. It may take more time. It may require a longer induction, since taking more subtle steps can be far more effective to get to deeper points. And, that is a point that I do want to make overall that I found is sort of a consistency, is if you can make an induction that, of course, the deprogramming does not directly refuse or refute. If you can find a way to do a very subtle induction that's very long, very personal, and works very fully, which we'll probably talk quite a bit more in another podcast about creating inductions. If you can make a very personal and very powerful induction that gets them even deeper than the programming, you can more comfortably talk about the programming without directly addressing it, and you can even work the pieces out more easily, just by identifying the fact that by going deeper, quote-unquote deeper, or getting into a more open and powerfully controlled state, it's kind of like tunneling under the foundation of someone else's building and working up, rather than having to go through all the security systems and go down. So, that's just a side point to understand. Once you get up to level 6, that's actually extremely... I would definitely say to not attempt that. Number 6 is gonna... I'll give you a story as to how complex it can get, just so you can understand. But for number 5, level 5, the main thing you'd want to do is to try and communicate and find which communication pathways they're comfortable with, and use this to give them information about where the flaws are, where the holes are, where the loose points are. And as you begin to work around that, you can even undo this. The trans is no longer working for this type of induction, and just using a different method, and it starts to show that that method of stopping you isn't working. The rapport will reduce the discomfort and make it focus more back on the programming, and then from there you work your way through the denial and all the pieces using things that we've talked about earlier, where you are making them more aware and taking control over it. Now, level 6 is the most complex, and again, this isn't an actual scale that you can use. This is just sort of how I'm shaping it so that you can better understand it. Level 6 looks at the idea that not only is this point not allowing itself to be altered, not only is it refusing to listen to direct logic that's given about it, and not only is it waking itself up, activating things, and trying to make itself uncomfortable and refuse further attempts. And there are many other aspects and factors that may play in things that it can try to do. These are just the most common and specific that can happen. It's also monitoring or keeping some type of response to awake efforts and attempts to even discuss it. Now, the most important part when it comes down to this is to understand just how complex this gets. I had an experience with someone I worked with. She had been programmed for a few years by this one very over-controlling and overburdening person who had programmed this into her, and she was poly. The only reason that she was able to have these two people in her lives was because, one, the nice one. So we'll go with person 1, person 2. Person 1 was a nice person. Person 2 was Mr. Controlling everything and put this all into her. Person 1 wanted to see her happy and was open to her being with this other person, but was very uncomfortable with her. Person 2 was the original person and was fine with person 1 because of the fact that they didn't see person 1 as a threat. Long and short story. Now, person 1 came to me and said they needed this programming undone. For many of you, that seems like red flags because they're saying this sounds like some type of undercover job. They wanted this to be taken away. I had a long discussion with this individual to make sure it's what they wanted and where the holes and the issues were, as well the method that I worked with that I'm going to describe also had an underlying working piece where if in the end that programming is actually what they wanted, I could easily, without it causing a specific outcome where if I was to reinstate it, it would all go right back the way it was, instead making it so that it would go back to a very similar state underneath the condition that it would be related to me or to the other person. For all the complexity I just said, think of it as I have done this enough that I've created fail-safes in how I work to make sure that if this was a mistake at any point, I could easily revert or reverse it as needed.
See the previous podcast.
It requires a lot of mental preparation and understanding, but the main pieces to understand from this was this. Number 1, this girl's life was beginning to fall apart because of it. The programming that was put into her was to make it so that she would always desire to be with this second person, the person who is not as caring in some ways, and who wanted it so that she would always be with him, and the programming on a very deep level made it so that if there was anything that would threaten that or go against it in any way, that she would disengage from it slowly. Little by little, over time, it would become a constant thing, though. This means that when she was with family who were trying to help her find her choices, and she was very set on this one person, they would deny it, or they would say that she should keep her options open, she would begin to disengage from them. When she was at work, and options and opportunities began to become scarce for different reasons, or she was being forced that she'd have to stay in this area, she began to disengage from it. So you can see sort of the pattern that's going on here is the programming was making it so that she was losing connection with her job, which means that she was at risk of losing it. She was disconnecting from family, and she was disconnecting from friends. And little by little, this was making it so her whole life was being turned towards this other person. The only issue is that this other person was not in any position to support them, care for them, or take care of them. And so this was becoming a very dangerous situation. And the reason this is a very complex situation as well is because she'd been programmed to take this as naturally. So that's why person number 1 came to me and said that they knew that this needed to change, because the individual was not identifying that it was a problem, was seeing this as completely natural, and was little by little letting her life slide off without seeing an issue. So I had to sit down, and as Puppet Master mentioned, we talked about this a bit before, so that we could agree whether or not this would be something that we could bring up. And I had a 6-hour non-stop discussion / session with this person. The first hour, I had to be so hands-off because I knew that this programming was now affecting critical parts of her life, which means a person coming in from the outside probably wouldn't be able to have a lot of impact from the start. And that going directly for it in any fashion, even appearing to do so, would be wrong. It would be seen as on guard. So I actually came in to start. The person who was in charge of it pretty much told her, this is another hypnotist, someone that I think is interesting. He knows a lot about similar facts and he's very experienced. Tried to give her a general view and definitely talked about how I was good at discussing with people what type of hypnosis they like and how it works. We spent the first hour talking about nothing but her interests, her outlines, her workings, what she believed in, how it functioned, what she thought about hypnosis, why she was into it, and just a very in-depth understanding, as much as I could gain from her viewpoints on hypnosis and how it worked and what it did. And since I was aware enough that this programming was making her go towards the second person, I realized that by gently mentioning that sounds good, that I was supportive, that I was there for that, it made it feel like this is natural and something she herself could support. The first hour was mainly just building up rapport, but also building up a structure of understanding that I understood her relationship there, and that my reasoning and logic lined up with what his was. So that means that to her, it seemed almost as though I had an understanding of his programming and his methods and his ideas, and in some cases, even more complex. Because of the fact that by showing that, it means that I could see pieces that might not already be there. This builds up the idea that now I could be talking about something similar to what he's done without directly going towards it. The second hour we were talking, I began discussing ideas and giving little points, because now that they were engaged in the discussion, they were drawn in and spending time. I was very subtly and very covertly, is usually seen as a negative term in some cases, but in this sense, covertly trying to benefit the person. And we talked about different pieces of how that hypnosis worked. And I would just make little side comments, nothing that I would directly approach, but one thing that they had said was that this programming, whenever they had it, they would feel pleasure. And I would go, oh, okay, from what? And they'd say, oh, from him. And I'd be like, oh, like, what would he be doing? It's like, just whatever. And I'd be like, oh, okay, well, maybe it could be more specific. And then it's not a negative. In some ways, it's a positive, because it sounds like I'm trying to help build it. But at the same time, I'm identifying that there are still holes there, but in a positive way, which means that it's not on guard, but it's building up. From there, during that hour, I tried to build all these little holes, connect them back to knowledge, and show that there are pieces that I could see that weren't there, even more, or that as you look deeper into the programming and into the deeper pieces of it, you begin to see situations where it may not apply. For example, this person was talking about how she felt like at work she was disengaging. She felt like it was not as fun of a job anymore, and I'd go, oh, okay. So I take it then you never really liked that job? I go, no, I mean, it was fun originally. I'm like, oh, okay, so what made you lose interest? It's like, I don't know, just over time I started feeling like it wasn't where I wanted to be. And I'd go, oh, okay, just nothing really specific? I mean, I could understand because I had this job and I lost interest because of the way they handled things. I mean, it wasn't specific, but I knew the source. And I'm like, maybe there's something there too. And just giving her little cues that there's something going on. In the third hour, I began to go a bit more direct. I began to work a little bit more fully towards it and talking with her about pointing out these little issues, these little outlines, just saying, I mean, it seems odd that there aren't specific details to it, but I guess if it's a general idea, it can work. And I mean, working with this hypnosis, if you were to have someone else do it, I mean, how would you want to do it? Sometimes they would say that they didn't know, but little by little, I began describing specific things happening. Like, well, maybe if the person was to relax, like if you were to, and at this point, I'm going to start describing a few things just to give emphasis, but also if it begins to affect you, I apologize. As such, I'm just going to say at this point, you are under no intention of having to feel this, but pretty much the idea of petting their hair, giving them hugs, just different things, and showing them how the responses could be used, and little by little, very covertly giving them these little directions to relax, to open. And this worked over an hour. This was pretty much like about a 50-minute induction of very indirectly pointing things out. From there, by the end of it, and for many of you who are thinking, yes, the one thing that I am very, very lucky for, and I wouldn't have done this otherwise, was she did have a CNC agreement with both her hypnotists that if they ever felt that someone else needed to come in and do something that they weren't capable of, they could. But as such, there had to be full conditions. I kind of was vetted by the first person, the nice one, and it was very, very subtle. So just so you know, for a lot of you who are sitting there going, this sounds very non-consensual, you did this without her agreeing to it, so on and so forth. This was a very specific situation that I wouldn't have gone through if things didn't line up the ways they did. So after about a 50-minute long subtle induction, the fourth hour was still very gentle, very cautious. I was still building with her and just carrying these holes in and saying, wouldn't you prefer something like this to happen? Wouldn't you like it if this piece was there? Not directly saying this is what's happening, but just still guiding and letting her mind make choices, make changes. And as the holes became bigger and showed where the gaps were, building out this internal piece, it eventually built up to where her mind was now beginning to accept different ideas, and I began to build a framework. This idea of, well, what do you think is important in your life? Well, my job, my family, all these beliefs that she had subconsciously. And we built all these out, and I began to point out, would you want anything to mess with it? And built out this idea of what they would want and what they wouldn't want, to allow their mind to reestablish itself in understanding what its goals are and its outlines. Kind of like with the earlier levels, where you just talk with them and let them do it naturally. This is where now, having gone past the external control, this is more of an internal understanding that it is now free to do, because it feels comfortable enough and it's not seen as a threat anymore. Once we'd built that out, the end of the fourth hour and going into the fifth hour was really building out and understanding these pieces are in place, but this piece of the programming seems to be different. Not saying it's wrong, not saying it's off, but saying, would you still want this? And they'd say, well, I kind of need it, is one thing. And then addressing, okay, it's needed because we discussed all of this. But is your job needed? Yes, okay, well, you know why your job is needed. Do you know why this programming is needed? Well, because I was told. Do you know why they needed it then? They just wanted to control me. Okay. Did they agree to control your job? No. Did they agree to control your family relationships? No. And you begin to show them the bigger holes. And with this situation, I showed her that that programming was primarily meant to make it so that others could not remove the relationship without her saying so, but that he had allowed it, the person, the negative from it, had allowed it to grow to an extreme and had not cared to undo it because, as we had mentioned earlier, some people like to build it out and not consider the backlash of it. And even when they see that, some people may not be considerate of it. And in this case, by the end of the fifth hour, I had shown that the original programming was now actually causing negative outcomes for them, directly against what they know deep down they wanted and needed. And then the last hour was mainly very carefully doing steps from the earlier pieces where you were building out and showing this is how it's taken apart, this is where it falls open, this is where the loose ends are, and this is how you begin to take control of it. Towards the end of the 6th hour and the pieces were falling off and she was realizing just how much damage was being done, she was breaking down crying. Now, one thing I hadn't mentioned from the starting, because I wanted this sort of to be an awareness similar to them going through this experience, was I had quietly had my system set up so that her person one, her nice master, could actually hear it. He wasn't in person with me, but I had set up a system where he could hear everything I was saying and everything she was saying, so he could follow along and understand it. And he was also very emotional at that point. When we finished the session, and the very gentle way I tried to bring it up was saying that, pretty much bring to her attention that he was here and asking her if that's what she wanted was to be with him and to continue, and if she needed some time with him alone. And she said yes, and I let them transfer over into a private chat of their own. And so at the very end of it, I had undone a lot of the work and they had connected. And about 2 hours later, they came back, they talked with me, we discussed it, and she very clearly outlined that yes, this was not what she wanted at all. And she was very glad that this had been undone and didn't realize just how far it had gotten. She ended up blocking the other person because it became very apparent that he wasn't thinking about her livelihood and what she needed at all. And she thanked me profusely. It's one thing that's good to know. I think beyond that, the experience all in all, because at that point they were exhausted. I was exhausted. It was about, I want to say it was about 5 p.m. my time, and I was exhausted. For them, it was much later. And so they ended up heading off to bed. And overall, deprogramming, as you get into these higher levels, gets to be extremely exhausting. But before they left, they did say, at least she said, and he became very aware along this pattern of just how much it takes. They became aware of the fact that no matter how deprogramming gets, we can get lost in our own thoughts, our own reasoning, our own understanding. And the deepest fact that we need to remember is no matter how deep we go into there, we need to be able to stop and ask ourselves what's going on and why we're doing it, so that we can actually keep track of how things are going and be able to respond accordingly. And so these people were very glad that they got that. And it's been a couple of years, but when I check in on them, they both seem to be doing very well. They've moved in together and she's recovered quite a bit. Her relationships were mendable. And so in the end, it can take a long time to learn how to do things. I mean, this 6-hour session was an extreme format, but it really comes down to how much you can learn about the person and how their mind works, and how much another person who would program in pieces, how their mind works, so that you can learn how do you do a push, pull, or a bit of a tennis match in your own head with what the right choices are.
An important thing I noted while you were telling that story is that you'd already considered that deprogramming can require aftercare as well.
Yes.
And thus you brought in the first partner. So that's an important note for anyone listening that may consider doing deprogramming, that just like everything else, play-wise, this can also require aftercare, because it can be quite an experience. There's another thing that I think people listening to this might come to this for, and I don't think it's something that we can cover so much here because it's a whole other thing. There are malicious files out there. I won't use their names because they can be triggers themselves, and it can be a traumatic thing to have gone into them, be given a personality that conflicts with your own, and then coming out the other side's hard. But that's part of it, maybe deprogramming. But there's also a thing called parts integration, which is when there's other personas in the mind, making that part of the whole. It's something that you want therapy to be set up before you even try that sort of thing, ideally, if possible. And that's a different thing to deprogramming. Parts integration is. So I just wanted to say that we haven't ignored that so much as it's outside the scope of this podcast.
Right. Deprogramming looks more at an internal programming that has been set that is to cause a specific event or outline, while parts integration is looking more at a part of the body or mind, or the mind, part of the mind has become a unique process that is growing, in many cases separately from the original mind, may function, have its own personality, and may have other aspects going on with it, and may be different and separate and have its own sense of reasoning and desires and logic than the original mind. And so addressing that is more than just addressing, because even though I've described it as aggressive programming, to a degree, compared to an alternate personality or other being, those beings are growing and actively working to become something of its own or to do its own desires and actions, while a programming here will remain, I can't say inert, it will still respond to things, but it will no longer be a self-sentient driving being in some cases.
Deprogramming deals with things more static in their structure.
True. Yeah, rather than a flexible growing piece that is more become.
Which requires you to actually converse with this other piece of the person and more. Yeah.
Yeah, I have another example for that, but for now, I would say that we've probably given enough for one sitting for people to figure out.
Or two.
Possibly for two. I mean,
it's a long podcast.
There is a lot to understand with deprogramming. Understanding the depths of it. This is just a simple version. But if you want to learn more, understand more, feel free to poke at me if you have a specific situation that you might need guidance on.
And if it sounds daunting, that's because it is.
It's because it's like, for those who play video games, or those who enjoy sports, or those who enjoy movies, imagine a specific form, or say your favorite of these. Favorite video game, favorite movie, favorite sports event that you've seen, favorite game that was played specifically. And then I want you to imagine the second favorite, if you have one. If not, just imagine another one that really sticks out in your mind, and think about all the similarities and differences between those two events. While the structure may be similar, for video games it might be the same genre, for sports games it may be the same teams. For the overall that I can say, imagine how different the unique pieces are to it, and how different the approaches would have to be to address it comparatively. And that's the difference.
An example of two popular games that come to mind are Dark Souls and Skyrim.
Right.
Like, they look like you're doing a similar thing at a glance. But if you played them both, one of them is very different to the other.
Right, or two very well-known games nowadays that people even in general would know would be Fortnite and Minecraft. They're both fun games. The graphics are very colorful. They're very different.
Buildings
in both. They're similar in certain aspects, but they're not the same in the core being. And that's the main point here, is you play Fortnite as a start-stop game that has combat and capability. Minecraft also has combat. You also do a lot of building. but the difference is the ultimate core and how flexible it can be.
And it's a different thing that you're trying to work out.
So the solutions and the choices will be different, and understanding that the more flexibility your mind has, the more capability you can work across different and new situations.
Thank you so much for joining us for today's topic.
If you've enjoyed this, you can support us at patreon.com/braincage. You can also join us over on Discord at Fetlandia and talk with us directly.
Links for both are listed in the description.
Thanks again for listening, and take care.